Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you to All Things Policy. In this episode, we'll explore the evolving landscape of walkability in Indian cities. From bustling cities like Mumbai and Bangalore to smaller cities like Kanpur and Bhubaneswar, walking remains one of the most common yet overlooked modes of transport. How walkable are our cities today? Are our footpaths safe, accessible, and inviting? In this episode, we deep dive into the state of pedestrian infrastructure in India and the factors that shape the same. Joining me for this episode are my colleagues, Suman, who manages Takshila's graduate public policy program, and Kripa, who manages our postgraduate program in public policy. Hi, Suman. Hello, Kripa.
Hi, Sarthak.
So, you have been in Bangalore for a while, Suman.
Yes,
and
for
Kripa
as
also,
long as I can remember.
Yeah, and Kripa, you have been in cities across the world, I would assume.
Makes
So-
me sound so glamorous. Yes.
Yeah.
In cities across the world, correct.
So, how has been your experience walking around Indian cities or global cities? In case of, for instance, in Bangalore, I have had these kind of difficulties. The nearest metro station is not very far from my place, but I usually prefer to take an auto. And again, other places also, I don't really find walking that convenient in Bangalore, even in some of the most prominent places in Bangalore or even in the hubs, so as to say. So what are your thoughts?
Actually, I'd like to go back a little. Back in my childhood, I grew up in a fairly well-planned, well-organized neighborhood where walking was not a problem at all. We walked to, maybe it was a function of economics, maybe it was a function of availability of other things, but we walked to everything. We walked to buy groceries, we walked to buy vegetables, we walked for leisure, we walked for everything, we mostly walked. And it was fairly good distances that we walked. I would put it at 3-4 kilometers at least. So I am not sure when that changed, or maybe I can put a...
But are you sure you're talking about the same neighborhood? The same neighborhood doesn't have...
At this point, when I went back to that neighborhood a few months ago, I saw that the width of the footpath has narrowed, and in some places, the footpath is non-existent.
My goodness.
Also, the fact is that the number of vehicles on the road have multiplied by a factor of 10, maybe. So it was okay maybe to walk on the roads that many, or whatever, a few decades ago when the vehicular density was itself low. But at this point, I don't see that at all happening in that neighborhood. Coming to the neighborhood that I stay in.
Currently,
less said the better, because it is
That's already saying so much.
it is a very, very busy neighborhood. Lots of vehicles and perpetual traffic jams. While there are footpaths, they're all in fits and starts. Okay, so firstly, you have a footpath that does not go uniformly through the road. You get up, you get down, and then climb back onto the footpath and walk somewhere.
sometimes the width also changes.
Width changes, and then there are some
Construction debris sometimes.
There are hawkers, vendors on the thing. So you have walking cannot be a meditative experience because you are always on the edge. You are always looking for what can come your way. And you have vehicles also coming from the opposite side on the footpath. Okay, so you have this entire system where the pedestrian is last in the list of priorities at this point in time. And this is an able-bodied pedestrian. We needn't go to senior citizens. We can't. Children, senior citizens, people with disabilities. I think it is a minefield for them. It is not even among. I mean, I have a senior citizen at home. My mother-in-law lives with me. For her, walking to the neighborhood store, although it is like 100 meters from the gate of my apartment, is not an option because the footpath or pavement is just non-existent, right? So, yeah, I have seen this in different ways, and it is constantly deteriorating. Much to what most people think. Yes, we like having trees. I like having trees, to see trees everywhere around. But having all these plants in the middle of the footpath, they just spring up like that is also an issue because you're running into them. Like we're walking into them. And if you're a runner, you have other issues. Let's not get into that. Yeah.
Fascinating and helpful for us to actually see the comparison of like how things have changed over time within the same city, right? So I guess to contrast with your experience, mine has been across different cities. But growing up, I grew up in Dubai, a very hot place. And by and large, like it is a pedestrian-friendly city, I would say. The major sort of limiting factor there, though, is the climate is so harsh in many ways that my walk back home from school was, even though it is such a short distance, we would just be wiped by the end of it because there isn't adequate shade or cover necessarily. You know, it was not necessarily a tree-lined path or anything we were walking down, just like in the harsh sun you're walking. So as much as the infrastructure was sort of there, it was maybe a harder one to use very frequently because longer distances in that type of climate is a tough one to cover. And then coming to sort of present day, a similar sort of experience to what Suman shared, right? Where my neighborhood doesn't have maybe, consistent widths in its sidewalks. It's not even a level path necessarily. So there are stones, but they're just sort of, like you said, if there's like a plant necessarily growing, that's a tough one. The other thing that I find is also you might have maybe the infrastructure there, but the density of the neighborhood is such that the sidewalk is so crowded. And then depending on the hour of the day, and I know at some point we'll also cover some of the gender dynamics of being a pedestrian. But depending on the time of day, if it's in the evening, so yesterday in the evening, I walked about 2 kilometers from one point in my neighborhood to the other. And it was very hard to occupy pedestrian space because businesses are open and it spills over into the sidewalk. You also have at certain points of the day, that the space is going to be occupied by more men than women. So I'd say about 60% of my walk time was on the road, even though there was technically a sidewalk there and technically it was a level sidewalk that I could have walked on. So there are all these other factors that sort of interrupt, I guess, the experience of having a smooth pedestrian experience. And then coming to, I know we're not getting into maybe running or using the space in that way, but if I think about even just the way in which my mindset as a pedestrian, I'm not putting music in necessarily. I have to be aware of my surroundings because there's no predictability in the path ahead of me. Versus I can recall walking in Canadian cities where you didn't have to worry at all. And I knew that like the best way for me to listen to my podcast was I knew I wanted to go for a walk and do it. And I knew that consistently there was a nice little path. And by and large, almost every neighborhood, even accounting for variances in socioeconomic status of different neighborhoods, there was a baseline expectation that you could have that there was a predictability to the sidewalks and I could walk anywhere and put a podcast on and it would not feel unsafe. It would not feel as though I would have to compete. My attention would have to be divided between what's on the sidewalk and the traffic and the people. And it just made it a little bit easier to navigate. So that's sort of
Please
been my
note,
experience.
Kripa uses the word sidewalk.
Oh my goodness, I know.
So it tells us
the North American tradition is bleeding in.
From.
And I think interchangeably like pedestrian walk, pavement. That's the other word.
Footpath also.
I've never in my life used the word footpath, but it makes perfect sense to use. I should maybe transition my lingo over, no?
No. Sidewalk is also very literal. Sidewalk is the side of the road.
As is footpath, which is quite nice. Yeah. Maybe should we pick a standardized term for the podcast? The pavement.
No, we can be inclusive. We can use different terms, whatever
Sounds
suits
good.
you. But yeah, given that you were talking about the experience of global cities, it might make sense to maybe compare Indian cities with some of these global cities, and not just the qualitative aspects, maybe the quantitative aspects as well, right? What are some of the interesting statistics with respect to walkability in India? Right. One thing that was kind of interesting for me was in India, a lot of people actually walk to work. In urban spaces, around 31% people, they walk to work. Which
Again, I think we are limited by our vision of work and commute.
Yeah.
We always think that everybody is taking, because we see the number of cars and we are traveling in cars and other motorized transport. We look at it like as if more people are traveling by cars rather than walking. But the truth is that
a lot of people are walking to work. And again, one of the reasons could be because they don't have a vehicle or they can't afford it. That could also be one of the reasons. And there was another interesting dynamic here was more women tend to walk for work, right? And again, this also reflects the income differences, wealth differences.
And also the preference or the priority that vehicle ownership grants to men. Like in a family, if there is one vehicle, it's always the male person who gets priority, who gets first dibs on the vehicle that is there. So it's almost always that the woman in the family is walking while the man is using the bike or whatever else that is there.
And since Suman, some time back, we were talking about how these footpaths or the crossings, right, they're not safe. Many times you have those risks that, okay, there will be maybe an accident. And pedestrian fatalities are quite huge in India, right? So there was this report in 2019 which pointed out that 17% of all the road traffic crashes are basically pedestrian deaths. And this is the official statistics. There are independent researchers who point out that this is way more, like almost 38%, double that, right? It reflects how unsafe it is, and which could also be the reason why maybe pedestrians don't prefer to I mean, those who would like to maybe
those who can afford
or who want to be, they also preferably won't take footpaths. There was one study on designs. Typically, what is the ideal design of footpath, right? I think someone, Kripa or Suman, someone right now you were talking about that, right? That width is usually not great. In case of India, these footpaths are somewhere between 1 to 1.5 meters wide. Usually, the standard is around 2.5 meters. So which also limits your mobility. And there was a survey in Bangalore. It found out that just 9% of all the surveyed streets had the right kind of pedestrian crossings.
What does it say that I'm actually surprised that the number's so high? It's like, wow, 9% had proper crossings.
So 91% of the places in Bangalore, the streets in Bangalore, it's not ideal. It's not that easy for you to cross these roads.
Yeah, also the fact that at this point, I think the authorities are prioritizing vehicular movement, right? So they're trying to do everything to make vehicles move faster. So for that, you will have free lefts, which means that vehicles can make a left anytime they want. And then you have those high barriers in the middle of the road, which means that pedestrians have to go across somewhere and then take a footbridge. First of all, very few footbridges and take a thing. Whereas vehicles need, I mean, I'm not saying vehicles don't need to go faster than they're going right now, but the speed of vehicles takes priority when designing for traffic or movement of traffic rather than pedestrian movement itself.
And this is usually not the case, right? For instance, I have been to some of the global cities or so-called pedestrian-friendly cities. This is not usually the case, right? You can easily, I mean, the way it is designed, you can continue to walk without any of these interruptions.
Right.
And even if you are, let's say, an elderly person who needs some sort of support or who requires a wheelchair, they can also move along that, right?
Parents in prams,
wheelchairs,
or if you want to carry a trolley, you can do that, which is not possible in the Indian context. A few days back, I was in Kormangala, like one of the places which is known for innovation, startups. They're all based out of Kormangala, Indiranagar, these places. Had to walk barely some 500 meters. It was just not possible.
My goodness. So ironic.
It was possible, but it took me way more time than expected.
Yeah.
Now, so I just want to go one step back. Right. So we have been talking about the situation in Indian cities, specifically Bangalore, when it comes to walkability.
Mhm.
So, and again, it is not great. And does it really make sense to prioritize walkability? Or maybe there are some other thoughts, right? Maybe we can improve on motorized transport, or maybe build our infrastructure all that way, and maybe that can be a better solution. What do you think? Is it relevant to discuss something like, or focus on something like walkability? These are all problems, but again, are these big enough problems?
From an economic development point of view, I'm sure the goal really is to get everybody to, not to get everybody to have a car or anything, but to move. When you move people up the ladder, there are a lot of cultural factors that play, and aspirationally, people will want to have cars. Also, as you grow in your profession or in your work, you are likely to move across the city. Like your work, areas of work expand. So you will look for work that is beyond walkable distances. Now, what is walkable for each person, you can define for each thing. But when you have that, then you need alternate sources of transport. Okay, so we can't say that you do not prioritize other means of transport. It is important, and therefore the role of public transport, buses or metro or any of that, comes into play. So should we prioritize walkability? We should prioritize walkability to the extent that it helps us get to a public transport place. Like you said, even to get to a metro station is difficult, right? So can we even move the needle on that particular thing itself? That is itself a first step, right? But it is important to, I think, more than the economics of it, it's important to prioritize that for different other reasons, because you want people to walk to the smallest of distances just for sake of, say, health, environment. I mean, because more the number of people walk and lesser vehicles go out on the road, I think you're solving a very small extent to the pollution problem too. So yeah, I think the more you make that walkable, the better it is for the environment and for an individual itself.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think the way I was sort of thinking about it is like, what segment of society would benefit most immediately from these types of improvements, right? And I think it can actually be folks who typically, like, for whom it makes a difference to be able to walk to work and have the option, like you were saying, like if there's a household that may have access to some kind of vehicle or a scooter or a bike or anything, that it might still be preferentially used by the man in the home. And so women have access suddenly to the public space or to physical mobility that allows them to get to a workplace a little bit easier if there were better sidewalks. But yeah, I think my train of thought on that was that it seems like low-hanging fruit that can reap like pretty significant rewards, particularly for immediately, I'd say like a lower, maybe folks who are in a lower socioeconomic status instantly, where there is, opportunity to walk about. Like if a household that is restricted by, like a woman might be restricted from going out simply because she doesn't have a means of transportation. If it were that sidewalks were easily accessible to someone like this, that the reward for that is really beneficial. I think in the longer term, there are other considerations that Suman talked about, right? Where as you're moving through, like in your career and things like that, you have access to option in different parts. But for a quick short-term fix that can have, like, I think a really good ripple effect, it seems like in maybe even the income and earning capacity of a household, it seems like a good solution to sort of prioritize. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I would just add to what Biz said in the beginning, right? So there is an economic rationale to it. I would also add some more economic reasoning why we should have walkability, right?
Yeah.
Those cities
Professor speaks.
Yes.
Those cities which typically have better walkability, right? They also tend to be the growth engines, so as to say, or within a city, there will be some areas which are more walkable than others. The real estate value, the worth of real estate over there tends to be higher. So there are some economic benefits associated with that also. Labor productivity can be higher in these kind of places. And again, this is not something which is not directly related to walkability, but it is indirectly related to walkability. Walkability and efficient land use, they kind of go hand in hand, right? So what it implies is on real estate, if you're able to develop real estate in such a way that you have more economic activity over there, you have, let's say, high rises over there,
Right.
those places will be well served if you have better walkability as compared to a situation where things are spread out.
Right.
In that case, you have to have either very good public transport infrastructure or you have to have your personal vehicles to move from one place to another. Right. So some of the most dense cities world over, right? For instance, a Seoul or a Tokyo or a Hong Kong, right? So they have focused on densification, but at the same time, walkability, right? So they kind of go hand in hand.
That totally makes sense. I actually was going to add not to take away from, I think there's a lot of economic reasoning that's in the room with us. But I was just thinking, like, the experience of walking, because we're limiting our conversation to urban centers primarily, right? Like, we're speaking of this in a setting that's really densely populated. And there is a very isolating experience being in an urban center in a city. And this opportunity to be outside walking increases the likelihood of you interacting with your neighbors, interacting with your community. It helps assuage some of that feeling of loneliness and isolation that you might, like a lot of people, especially if we're talking of, I can only imagine like cities that are like migrant destination cities, like a Mumbai might be, where people are traveling so far for the sake of economic opportunity in that city. It really feels compounded when you're in this very, dense space, but you don't have opportunity to interact. And your workplace, of course, offers some of that, connectivity. But to reinforce some of that communitarian feel in your experience as a person in an urban center that's so crowded, walkability seems like a really great way to even interact with people, to have like
you keep on meeting most likely same people. You will exchange words.
Totally.
And
yeah.
you keep seeing the same surroundings, maybe.
Yeah, which can help build a sense of trust also in that
trust,
area,
attachment,
and safety. Yeah. Yeah.
Which
absolutely.
again is a problem in case of India, right? We don't have social capital. This is something that we keep on talking about. So cities which have more walkability may have higher social capital, and which again builds into civic engagement,
right?
Which might not be very strong in the Indian context. In fact, there is a very good paper on this which says those cities which promote walking, they activate imagination and creativity. We'll share the link of the paper with this, and it empowers people to act by creating trust and familiarity.
Yeah, I just, to just give a very local flavor to this. The experience of walking, say in a mall, okay, is very different from walking on commercial street, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Of course,
for listeners who might not know, the commercial street is like a really bustling sort of like shopping district, sort of in the heart of the city, and there's a lot of stores that are really on the sidewalk almost.
Yeah. So
can be equivalent to Lincoln Road in Mumbai.
Yeah.
And maybe Lajpat Nagar Market or something in Delhi.
Cool. Yeah.
So, we have grown. I think it's now not so fashionable to shop in those places, or not so in to now. Most people shop online, but that's a different thing. But I think those places at some point had a lot of walkability quotient to them. Okay, with time, the number of motorists on that road have increased. But again, you see that when they restrict the number of, there are, a lot of places, I don't know about here, but in a lot of other cities or things, you restrict motorized movements at some parts of the day to make it easier for pedestrians to walk through those things. And then they see that, there is an increase in businesses on those in that area. You see an increase in actual footfalls into your place. So there are all those business-related things also to walkability. Because imagine taking your car and going from shop to shop on thing, right? It just doesn't make sense. So what will you do? You will just not walk on that road. Instead of that, if you make the road walkable, you will have more people going to more shops on a particular street.
Interesting. So now that we know that walkability is something that needs to be prioritized, and it has not been a priority in case of India or cities like Bangalore. So what do you think are the reasons why India hasn't prioritized cities' walkability? Why does India perform poorly in terms of walkability?
In spite of having the most number of people who walk, right? It seems to me that the elite preferences always take
Precedence.
And also, I think in the government or policy circles, somehow it's very fashionable, or it's very thing to say that we are building this underpass to take vehicles from here to here in 10 minutes, or we are building this flyover that will move traffic very fast from point A to point B. The deprioritization of pedestrians, I think, is an important failure point in the entire mobility landscape of India.
Yeah. So, when you mentioned that there is the construction of flyovers or underpass, it seems more attractive. I think there is another angle also, right? The focus on not having the right kind of public transport infrastructure is the problem, right? Because if you don't have public transport infrastructure, you have to have something. So then it takes precedence. Right? So
and also, it's easier for a politician to show, when you show this grand flyover that you have just built and inaugurated, you are likely to get favor. I mean, you are likely to be in the better...
You're telling me it's more exciting than saying, I inaugurate this footpath.
Yeah, it is. Don't you think?
No, I'm kidding, of course.
Right? So I think, those political economy questions also come into play as to why we don't have walkable cities.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that came to mind, and I think we'll cover this even in our conversation, was this idea that vehicles being aspirational for society. And I was comparing that with Western societies, and we're speaking in very general terms, of course, right? Because variance will exist. But I'd say that in maybe many urban centers, let's say in Canada, it's fairly appealing to be able to say that I bike to work, or I'm from a city like Ottawa where it was fun for people to say I skate to work. The element of saying like, that's someone, because that signals that I'm someone who prioritizes my personal health, I'm someone who cares about the environment. There's a lot of virtue signaling that is possible in those types of societies than saying that, I drove into work. So there is that element of the way in which sort of public space and having like a pedestrian experience is still seen as slightly a little bit more appealing to talk about than and may allow you to sort of exalt yourself as an individual versus in a more communitarian environment like India is, where you want to signal to your neighbors and your family and everybody that look how much I've earned, or look how my family can afford to travel safely in this way. And I don't have to align myself with the mass mode of transportation, which is by their feet. So in both instances, actually, it's a way to distinguish yourself from the crowd sometimes.
Yeah. So I think owning a car in India is also aspirational to a large extent, right? It is kind of a status symbol. I think, I don't remember who said this, but I think it was related to Maruti 800 or something. Because when Maruti 800 was initially in the market, people wanted to buy that because it immediately after you own, it changes your social status. So, but again, that has got to do something with the kind of society that we have, where the hierarchical society, where you need to have some different, you have to have something different from the others. So maybe a car is something which helps.
One of the Honda slogans is the power of dreams. So that, you aspire that it is your dream perhaps to own a vehicle like this, and to acquire it is a realization of that dream. Yeah. Interesting.
So, apart from this car, right, another thing that I think is also a kind of status symbol in case of India is owning individual homes. And people prefer to have individual homes as compared to apartments, right? If they have an option of going for an individual home, they will do that instead of apartment. And these kind of preferences leads to a city being spread out horizontally as compared to a city rising vertically. And given that the demand for high rises might not be there, in most of the cases, policymakers are also not incentivized to increase the floor space indexes. And we have horizontally spread out cities and not vertical cities, which again might not be conducive for walking.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we need to take into consideration when we are talking about why walkability is not a thing in India, the law and order situation. Right? If I don't feel safe walking on the roads,
absolutely.
I'm going to prioritize something else. I'll take my own vehicle. I will
If you have the
invest.
option to,
If I
yeah.
have the option, I will invest in my own vehicle and go. And we say law and order, it is street lighting, it is just maybe number of, the police patrolling that happens or anything else. Just
how safe you feel.
How safe everybody feels.
Correct.
And, that in cities, you should not have that problem because you have so many people around you. But even so, I don't think it is safe to walk in a lot of neighborhoods in Bangalore, at least after a certain point in the evening. I don't know how safe people feel. But again, that perception of safety and thing also has to come. And so I think, walkability gets deprioritized.
I was going to add actually to that point also something that I was a bit surprised by when I moved to Bangalore or just spent time in Indian cities was the fact that drivers have no regard for pedestrians, right? It's not seen as...
pedestrians don't have right of way.
They don't have right of way. It's not seen as a shared resource that we are sharing the road together. It's seen as it is primarily for vehicles.
I'm doing you a favor by letting you
That's right, if anything. Whereas I think I'm accustomed to a culture where if a pedestrian is seen approaching a crossway and let's say there's no zebra crossing or whatever, or a pedestrian walk, a vehicle might account for it, might slow down a little bit or might... at the very least,
Do you say crosswalk or do you say pedestrian?
Oh, now it's in my head. I'm like, zebra crossing for sure is not what we say. What do we say?
You say crosswalk.
Pedestrian, crosswalk, I guess. Yeah. So one, the likelihood of having a crosswalk even is higher outside of India, it feels like. But even so, when you are on road, you notice, I realized that my initial expectation was for a vehicle to slow down or for a vehicle to realize, that there's a pedestrian or someone coming up. Over here, though, I find that the way traffic works is that you're more likely to weave around a pedestrian. So there are actually instances when I stop to give way to a scooter or a bike and they're so surprised because they're like, no, you just keep walking. We will walk around you, of course. And so there's a little bit of just confusion on the road for a moment when I'm trying to cross. But
at
just
least that's pleasant. In a lot of times, it can get very unpleasant. People are hurling abuses at each other.
And you'll also find scooters on the
sidewalk. I've been honked out of the way on a sidewalk. I was and for a moment I was so confused. I'm like, sorry, where am I? Oh, wait, I'm on the sidewalk. But it seems like it's not for me to use.
And sometimes these vehicles will be coming from the opposite side.
Even better. Yeah.
So apart from these, I don't know, where do we fit all these things? Cultural, social, I don't know. Apart from that, there is also the political aspect, right? So when you say you don't have footpaths or the design of the footpath is not good or you don't have the right kind of crossings, why do you not have this basic infrastructure in place? Who is the authority who is responsible for creating this infrastructure? Most of us will even not know, right, who is responsible for these things. So in case of India, one of the typical problem is urban governance is not given due importance. We have 3 levels of government: union government, state government, and the local governments. Typically, the local governments do not have enough revenues with them. And on top of that, cities are not necessarily there in the public discourse.
Yeah.
The elections to the union government, to the state government, for the assembly elections or for the parliamentary elections, we all know about it when it is happening. In many of the cities, you don't even have elections, regular elections. In Bangalore also, we haven't had for 5 years.
So some minister has promised we will have it in May.
Oh,
how do even the citizens participate in this process, right? How do they even put their demands?
Yeah.
So that civic engagement is also not lacking. On top of that, the municipal bodies, right? They don't have the capacity, they don't have the revenue streams for all these things. So
which is such a shame. Yeah. And I think part of it is also that, there's this article that we were reading speaks of the expectation that the average city dweller may have of their government even. Like, you're not accustomed to even expecting something like this, so you might not even think to ask. And then what Sarthak just mentioned is, even if you do think to ask, who are you asking? And even if you do ask, how will they deliver? So it seems like so many layered issues.
So many issues. Yeah. So we now have discussed all the problems. So what are your thoughts? What can we do to improve on it?
I think firstly, cities should have revenue.
Let's that's a nice solution. I like that. That's a good one.
Money is most important.
Because without money, I don't even know how much is getting devolved to the local bodies.
Sure.
So first, money, and they should find ways to raise their own revenue. Right? With the GST regime, it's a little maybe not as, they don't have that many sources, but you should find ways to raise more revenues. That is, I think, single. And what are those ways of raising revenues is something that we can discuss.
So Suman, when you say they should have more money, that means they should have more money from the union government, or they should get more money from the state government, or they should generate their own revenue?
Ooh,
They should definitely
I was going to say all of the above.
No, I think.
But practically, yeah.
So again, my thoughts on this, they should have more resources, but again, they should also try to figure out ways by which they can generate their more revenue.
Yeah, so they're not so dependent on transfers.
Currently, the problem that most of the cities in India have is they're dependent on the union government, mostly the state governments on the revenue source.
Which will sway based on also political will that changes. Yeah.
So the priorities of individuals, right, who are in that particular jurisdiction, the people who are at the state government level, right, that will not converge, right? They will decide something and these people might not want that.
Agree, yeah.
So there is again an interesting concept that we have talked about before as well, Vixelian connection. That means...
Did you know?
No, I'm learning. I'm learning so much on this podcast. Thank you, Sarthak.
Yeah. So those who have the power to decide on behalf of someone, those who are benefiting and those who are paying for this, right? There should be a convergence. In India, that is not the case because the local governments, they are not necessarily having the revenue. The spending by the local government is decided by the state governments or in some cases by the union government. So that overlap is not there, which in turn implies civic engagement will be weaker.
Low. Yeah, that
in
makes
fact, the
sense.
civic engagement part is very interesting. It is like that feedback loop. If you have good civic engagement, these things will change. And if you have better walkability, pedestrian-friendly cities, urban mobility is better because of this, then it also feeds into civic engagement, right? So a feedback loop. Anything else?
What could be done better? I mean, to the point that I was raising earlier, that I think people can have greater expectations of their cities and not feel
so are
a
we
sense
anemic
of
with our aspirations right now?
Yeah, I think so. I think there should be some sense of that we do need to have, I mean, if these are cities that we're living in, we should have fair access to the public space. And if that means having more sort of walkable spaces, then that's a fantastic thing to expect. I think the problem sometimes with some persistent and complex ills like this, there is that sense of you just make peace with it, right? You're just like, well, okay, I've fallen into my routine. If I know that I'll have to hitch a ride with my neighbor who will drop me off at the metro station and then I will, and whatever, you've found a way around it. Much like the traffic analogy earlier, you just weave around the problem a little bit. But perhaps it is a good thing to be discontent, right? Because having that type of discontent will allow you to hold, people in positions of authority and decision making to account, and you can expect more. And the hope is that politics will exist downstream of what society's expectations are, and the more you expect and demand of your leaders, then the more likely they are to deliver on some of those expectations.
So the discontentment, two aspects here, right? One is yes, people have become they are passengers here, right? They are not really bothered about what is happening. They've given up.
Ironically, passengers.
Yeah, that's why I use the term passengers, right? So that's one aspect. But another aspect is you have a lot of people who move to the cities, right? They are not from that specific city.
Right.
For them to feel the connect with the cities, right? You also need to create that conducive circumstances, right? When you have the rise of different kinds of cultural factors, maybe some linguistic based resentment, right? Yeah. So all these things might reduce the connect,
your feeling of belonging to the city also. Right? Yeah.
So, and a lot of times I think in India, the elite disengagement from public life is very, very, very high because you see that the state cannot deliver. You
find alternatives.
You find private, which is not by itself bad, but I think the exit of the elites is a problem in big ways because now what we've done is we've created walking paths inside our apartment blocks so that we don't have to go outside to walk. Right? So that is all. I mean, maybe that's a workaround, but it is for a very, very small sliver of the population. We need to have public spaces that are...
It is actually reflective of the fact that the governments might not have been good with delivering different kinds of public goods, such as law and order, right? So law and order is not great outside.
So
we have
internalized.
created small compartments where we have the right kind of law and order.
And just also that idea of individualism, right? Like that this, all I care about are the factors that affect my immediate life, and something that affects my neighbor is not as important to me. And you can sort of disengage and say like, I don't care for, which, yeah. And it seems like a lot of sort of public problems seem to be stemming also from that, yeah.
And then there are some economic tools which could possibly be used, something that some of our colleagues have been championing for a long time now. One of the reasons why you can't walk on the footpath is because
Cars are parked.
already parked, right? So this creates multiple problems.
Transfer of wealth.
So this creates, because people can't walk on top of that. The roads have also become narrow. So maybe something like parking fees, right? So if you are leveraging it, you are able to generate revenue. At the same time, you are ensuring that the footpaths are also
We
empty.
can link an article on this exact topic as written by Nitin recently.
Yeah. And then some cities have been experimenting with different methods, congestion pricing and all. So maybe something like this can be tried, at least in some cities in India. Anything you would like to add?
I think also property tax is a local government imperative. So getting more efficient with collection of taxes will add to revenue sources, and that can be put if there is sufficient push and pull for such things.
And also the complementary goods here, right? For instance, right kind of public transport infrastructure is important. If you don't have that, people will, till some point they will walk, or else they will have to use some form of private transport.
Yeah.
So that's again another challenge in most of our cities. We need to improve our public transport.
We have a metro coming up very close to my house, but the road to getting to that metro is nobody is even thinking about it, and it's a nightmare. I hope that road gets done so that we solve that problem.
So the hope is that those decision makers are listening to an ATP episode like this one today.
So with that hope, we should conclude our discussion for today. Thanks, Suman. Thanks, Kripa.
Thank you, Sarthak.
Thank you, Sarthak.
Thanks to our listeners for joining in. We'll meet again
in
another episode of Next Month.
Looking forward to it.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.